When my dad died, it felt like a pillar in the world had quietly collapsed, and everything else shifted an inch to the left, familiar but permanently off-center in a way I couldn't fully describe. I'm an only child, and after Mom passed when I was 13, it was just the two of us living in that tired old house at the edge of town, the one with the rusty mailbox and the porch that sagged like it needed to exhale. Dad was never the soft, confessional kind of father. He showed love through things like keeping the truck running, making sure the pantry was stocked, and handing me a flashlight whenever the power went out so I could learn to navigate darkness proper. We weren't close in the way people talk about closeness. We were close in the way two stubborn men can be when neither is good at saying what he means. After I moved out, we only talked on the phone once every couple weeks. He always sounded the same, strong, steady, like someone carved out of cedar and old diesel fumes. So when the hospital called and told me he was gone, it didn't make sense that such a solid voice could simply go silent. I came home to a house that felt too large without him, too quiet in ways that crept into the corners of my mind. Every room still held the shape of him, like a scent that refuses to dissipate. Grief didn't hit me all at once. It soaked in slowly, settling into the floorboards the way spilled oil worms its way into concrete. By the third day, the house had stopped feeling like a home and more like an abandoned project someone had walked away from halfway through. Maybe that's why I finally climbed into the attic, because if I kept sorting through the ground floor, I was only skimming the surface of his life. The attic was where he kept the things he didn't want to forget. I hadn't been up there since I was a teenager. Back then, the attic had been forbidden, not literally, but in the sense that Dad always changed the subject whenever I asked about the boxes stored up there. It was the one space he never fully let me into. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, dust blooming under my breath like tiny ghosts. The attic was dim, lit only by a small yellow bulb that flickered whenever the wind pressed against the siding. Old cardboard boxes leaned against one another like tired relatives at a wake. There were Mom's sewing bins, 2 crates of my childhood toys, a stack of photo albums I hadn't seen in years, but my eyes gravitated toward the back corner of the attic, where a familiar shape sat half buried under a tarp and a thick pelt of dust, the red metal toolbox. As a kid, that box had fascinated me. Dad carried it everywhere, into the truck, into the backyard shed, even into the house when storms rolled through. He treated it with a seriousness I didn't understand. When I was maybe 10, I asked him why he kept it locked. He paused in a way that unsettled me even then, his hand resting on the dented lid. "Some things are for fixing," he said quietly. "Some things are for keeping." I didn't know what that meant, but the way he said it made me walk away without asking more. Now, seeing the toolbox again, the memory came back with the same heaviness. It sat exactly where I remembered it. Same dent on the left hinge, same rust creeping around the latches, same sense of being more than metal. I knelt and pulled it forward. Even through my gloves, it felt warm. Not room temperature warm. Warm like someone had been holding it minutes earlier. A ripple of unease slid under my skin. I told myself it was just my imagination, the attic heat pooling in the corner. But the attic wasn't warm. It was freezing enough that I could see my breath in faint curls. I carried the box downstairs, 2 hands gripping the handle because the weight of it felt wrong for its size. Too heavy, too dense, as if something inside resisted being moved. I set it on the coffee table, and the wood groaned beneath it. For a long time, I just stared at it, remembering how Dad once told me, "Don't open this unless I'm gone, and even then, be sure you want to." At the time, I thought it was one of his cryptic, slightly dramatic warnings. Now that he was actually gone, the sentence felt like a locked door inside my chest. I spent the rest of the day sorting through the house. Clothes, service medals, faded Polaroids from the 1970s. But the toolbox kept pulling at the corner of my mind like a word stuck on the tip of my tongue. Every time I passed the living room, I scanned it to see if it had shifted. I told myself that was ridiculous, but grief does strange things to time and attention. By nightfall, the house felt too big, too hollow, the kind of hollow where sounds echo wrong. The wind rattled the siding like someone dragging their fingers along it. The floor popped as the temperature dropped. Small, normal noises suddenly felt loaded. Around midnight, as I was pouring myself a glass of water, I heard a soft thud from the living room. I froze. Not the kind of noise furniture makes, not settling wood, a single, contained knock from inside the box. I walked into the room slowly, pulse banging in my ears. The toolbox sat on the coffee table, exactly where I'd left it, but the lid was misaligned now, shifted maybe 0.5 millimeter open at one corner, like something inside had pushed, just once, enough to let me know it was there. I didn't open it. I didn't touch it. I just sat down on the opposite couch cushion, staring at it until my eyes burned. Hours passed that way. No more noises, no more shifting, but I felt something in the room with me, a tension, a pressurized stillness, like the air was waiting for me to make a decision. I slept with the hall light on, something I hadn't done in nearly 20 years. Even then, I dreamed of the box, its red paint glimmering in the dark, its heavy lid breathing in and out with slow, patient rhythm. Morning brought no clarity. If anything, the daylight made the box feel more out of place, like it shouldn't exist in an ordinary room. Determined to get answers, I dragged out a screwdriver and a pair of pliers and tried the latches. They didn't budge. The metal resisted in a way that felt intentional, almost hostile. I wedged the screwdriver under the lid and pressed until my hand shook. Nothing. That's when I decided to search through Dad's papers. Maybe there was a spare key, instructions, something. Instead, buried in a box of receipts and old newsletters, I found an envelope with my name on it in his unmistakable handwriting. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper. 4 words. The key is yours. No signature, no explanation, just confirmation. There was something else inside the envelope. A hand-drawn map of the backyard, showing the old oak tree, the fence line, the storage shed. At the base of the oak, an X. The key was buried there, waiting. I stood at the back door, boots on, shovel in hand, staring out at the winter woods behind the house. The tree lines swayed in the breeze. The shadows between the trunks seemed darker than they should have been. Whatever was inside that box had waited a long time, and my father had trusted, no, forced, me to be the one to open it. I should have listened to the warning in his voice, but grief can make you brave in the wrong direction, and I was already stepping into the cold. Digging for the key felt strange in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with instinct. The kind of instinct that lives in the spine rather than the mind. The kind that whispers you're about to cross a line no one can uncross for you. The soil beneath the old oak tree was softer than it should have been in winter, dark and damp, like something had been patiently breathing beneath it. I dug through roots and clumps of dirt until my shovel scraped against metal. At first I thought it was a piece of pipe, but when I knelt down and brushed the earth away with my fingers, I found a small tin container about the size of my palm. It was sealed with wax. I cracked it open, and there, nestled inside a square of fabric, was a tiny iron key that looked hand-forged, uneven, pitted, old. The moment I touched it, a faint vibration moved up my fingers, almost like a hum. Not electrical, something older, something aware of being touched again after decades. I dropped it instinctively, brushing dirt off my palms, heart racing. When I picked it up a second time, trying to be rational, the vibration was gone, but the memory of it clung to my skin like static. The walk back to the house felt longer than usual, the woods alive with the soft hiss of wind through branches. Once or twice, I thought I heard the crunch of footsteps offset from my own, but each time I turned, I saw only the long stretches of dark between trees. I tried to shake it off. Grief can make the world feel haunted, even when it's perfectly ordinary. But there was something different about the silence around me that day, something concentrated. It wasn't the silence of nature, it was the silence of a held breath. By the time I stepped back into the house, my pulse was thumping so loud in my ears I could almost hear it echo off the walls. The toolbox sat on the coffee table, exactly where I'd left it the night before, except now it felt like a presence rather than an object, a quiet audience to my every move. I placed the iron key beside it. For a moment, nothing happened. No hum, no shift. Then, almost imperceptibly, the lid clicked, as though something inside had turned its head. I backed away. I didn't open it. Not yet. I wanted to know who my father had been before I stepped into whatever this was. So I spent the rest of the morning moving through the house like an archaeologist in his own childhood museum. I found his old flannels, still stiff with the scent of cedar, his navy ring in a small dish by the back door, 3 of Mom's cookbooks lined up on the kitchen shelf, exactly how she'd left them 20 years ago. But with each object, a different version of Dad surfaced in my mind. Not the stern, quiet man I grew up with, but someone younger, more hopeful, before life carved its hard lines into him. I found a stack of letters he wrote to my mother while deployed overseas. Letters where he admitted fear, longing, dreams of having a son someday. I found Polaroids of my parents smiling in the sun. Dad's smile looked larger than I remembered, like he hadn't yet learned to brace himself for something only he could see coming. The deeper I dug, the more pieces of him I found that didn't fit with the man who warned me to stay out of the woods at night, who slept with a lantern on in the garage, who kept a toolbox locked for decades. By afternoon, I'd convinced myself that whatever was inside the box was probably symbolic, sentimental, old photos, documents about Mom, maybe something to do with his service, rational explanations, the kind that help you ignore every instinct screaming otherwise. But the more I tried to push logic onto the situation, the more the house resisted the idea. The hallway light flickered only when I walked past the toolbox. My dog, who loves everything except thunderstorms, refused to step into the living room, staring at the box with his fur raised along his spine. Every so often, the wall clock would skip a beat, just 1 second missing, as if time stuttered when passing near the red metal. Even the air felt different, growing thicker the closer I got to the table, like the atmosphere around the box had weight. And yet through all this, the memory of something shifting inside the night before tugged at me in a way that felt personal, as if the box wasn't finished calling for attention, as if it had waited long enough. But instead of opening it, I called a few people who'd known my dad best, old neighbors, men from the VFW hall, his fishing buddy Harold, who'd been around since before I was born. I didn't tell them about the box. I just asked what they remembered about him in his younger years. Their answers weren't what I expected. Multiple people mentioned how Dad used to take long walks into the woods behind the house late at night, carrying a lantern and nothing else. Harold said he'd seen Dad once standing perfectly still at the tree line, just watching the darkness like he was waiting for it to move. Another neighbor said he'd sometimes heard Dad talking quietly in the backyard when no one else was around, not mumbling, talking, answering someone or something. But the thing that unsettled me the most came from Mrs. Donnelly, who'd lived next door since before I was born. He was a good man, she said, "but I always felt he was protecting you from something, and not just the world, something specific." When I asked her what she meant, she simply said, "He was always looking past the house, not at it, through it, like something was following him and he was hoping it wouldn't notice you." Her words sank in deep. My father had been afraid of something. Not people, not trauma, something that required rituals, lanterns, locked boxes, late-night vigils. And then it hit me. He never told me to be careful. He told me to be sure, as if certainty itself somehow mattered. It was nearly sunset when the house shifted again. The floor vibrated softly beneath my feet, like a truck passing by. Except there was no truck. The windows shuddered in their frames. The dog whimpered and pressed himself against the far corner of the hallway, and the toolbox made a sound, a small but unmistakable noise that shot fear straight up my spine. It whispered, not a voice, not words, more like the faintest exhale from between metal edges, as if something inside had leaned closer. I reached for the iron key. It felt warm again. In my palm, it pulsed once, just once, like a heartbeat responding to my touch. Then the air around me shifted, the way it does when you open the door to a room that someone has just left. A subtle change in pressure, a quiet acknowledgement. My father had lived with this box for decades. He had kept it close. He had kept it locked. He had warned me. And yet, in his final message, he still left the key for me, as if what was inside wasn't meant for safety anymore, but inheritance. By the time the last light faded from the windows and the living room sank into blue dusk, I knew I was going to open it. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe answers, maybe closure, maybe a glimpse into whatever life my father lived outside my understanding. But I also knew this. Some things don't rattle inside a box for no reason. Some things wait. Some things listen. Some things remember who last held them. And as I sat down in front of the toolbox, iron key trembling between my fingers, the house felt like it leaned in around me, holding its breath for the moment I would turn the key. The iron key felt heavier than it should have been, the kind of weight that doesn't come from metal but from expectation, like it had spent years waiting for a specific hand to hold it again. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor with the toolbox in front of me, the lamp casting a tight circle of light that made the rest of the house feel too dark, too distant. Every instinct in my body told me not to open it. Every memory of my father, the steady hands, the stern warnings, the nights he stood by the back door listening to whatever moved in the woods, told me this was something meant to remain closed. But grief does a strange thing where curiosity becomes a kind of substitute heartbeat, pulsing louder than fear. And maybe a part of me believed that if I could understand this one last secret, I'd understand him, what shaped him, what haunted him, what he tried so hard to keep between himself and the dark. My fingers trembled slightly as I fitted the iron key into the lock. The metal slid in with a soft, almost relieved sound, as though the lock recognized the key after years of separation. I exhaled slowly, turned it. The click was not a mechanical click. It was too organic, too soft, like something exhaling after holding its breath for decades. The latches lifted without resistance, and for a moment I didn't open the lid. I just listened. The house had grown impossibly quiet. The refrigerator hum stopped. The heating unit stopped. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. A silence so deep it felt like a pause in time. Then the smallest sound broke it. A faint shift from inside the toolbox, like something sliding into place. Not aggressive, not animal, just aware. I lifted the lid. Inside, at first, everything looked disappointingly normal. A few old items arranged with care. a leather notebook tied with a fraying string, a hunting knife wrapped in flannel, a jar of some kind of dark powder, a folded newspaper clipping browned with age, and a Polaroid photo face down. The inside of the toolbox smelled faintly of oil, dust, and something older, like the scent of a basement that's kept secrets too long. But underneath all the ordinary objects, I felt something else. Not seen, not heard, felt. A heaviness, a presence like the air above the box had thickened, as though the space inside it was bigger than the metal walls could explain. I didn't touch anything right away. My hands hovered above the contents, as though the items themselves radiated temperature. And strangely, they did. The leather notebook was cold. The knife felt neutral. The jar, even from a distance, seemed warm, strangely warm. I reached first for the newspaper clipping. It felt safe, the most mundane thing in the box. Paper can only hold so much danger, but the second my fingers brushed it, a shiver crawled up my forearms like the memory of cold water. I unfolded it, carefully. The headline read, "Local Boy Missing. Search Halted. July 18, 1976. A boy of about 12, brown hair, thin, last seen near the woods behind County Road 9. My father would have been a teenager then, old enough to remember, old enough to be afraid. But what hit me hardest was the name, Samuel Calder, my father's surname, my surname. I didn't know anyone in our family tree named Samuel. There were never stories about cousins or uncles or siblings. My father always said he grew up essentially alone, but the boy in the clipping had my father's jawline, sharp, determined, the same tension between the eyebrows. And suddenly I realized my father had a brother he never spoke about. The air in the room seemed to shift again, almost leaning toward me. I placed the clipping on the coffee table and reached for the notebook next. The leather felt older than anything else in the box, well thumbed, softened by years of handling. When I untied the string and opened the first page, I expected dates, maybe stories about the war or memories of Mom. But instead, the first page held a single sentence written in my father's neat, blocky handwriting. If you're reading this, it means I've failed to keep it contained. A cold weight settled in my stomach. The second page held a crude map of our property. The same oak tree from the key map, the shed, the back fence line. Tiny X's marked various spots near the tree line. And along the bottom, 4 words repeated over and over. Don't look at it. Don't speak to it. Don't follow it. Don't let it see you first. My father, the man who never wrote grocery lists because he said they were too dramatic, had written warnings that looked like commandments carved by someone who'd spent a lifetime negotiating with fear. Before I could turn another page, I heard it. A knock. Not from the front door, not from the back door. Inside the house. 3 soft taps, like fingers on wood. I spun around, heart thundering against my ribs. The sound came from the hallway, specifically the wall near the attic ladder, the place where the insulation had always seemed too thin, where cold air seeped through even in summer. I stayed perfectly still. The silence returned, thick, listening. House settling, I whispered, though the words felt brittle in my mouth. Houses don't settle in deliberate patterns or in greetings. I turned back to the box. The Polaroid was still face down. My hand trembled slightly as I picked it up. The back was blank, except for a single penciled date, 11/04/1978, the year before my father enlisted in the Navy. I flipped it over. A tree line, nighttime, flash lighting up the closest trunks. But between 2 trees, barely visible at first glance, was something in the frame, something tall, something leaning forward. not clear enough to see a face, but the eyes, those tiny reflective discs, shone exactly in the center of the flash. 2 points of light that made my skin crawl because they didn't look caught by surprise. They looked expectant. I placed the Polaroid down, face down, pressing it hard against the table, as if that could change the fact that I had seen it. The dog upstairs began barking suddenly, violent, panicked barking, the kind that means he's seen something that makes no sense to him. Scrabbling claws followed, pacing back and forth above my head. Then silence. One sharp silence, as though he stopped mid-step. My breath caught. Then, softly, a single whine. I pushed myself off the floor and half ran up the stairs, my chest tight. When I opened my bedroom door, the dog stood facing the window, frozen, not wagging, not panting, just staring at the curtain with rigid, trembling focus. The hair along his spine bristled straight up. I stepped beside him and pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. No figure. No creature. Just the backyard bathed in deepening twilight. The oak tree motionless in the cold air. And yet, the feeling didn't leave. Not the weight. Not the pressure. It felt like something had been there, had looked in, had moved away only when I arrived. I stayed at the window longer than I should have, searching the tree line for any sign of movement, any glimmer of light reflecting off eyes. Nothing. Eventually, the dog slumped to the floor, trembling, and I forced myself back downstairs. When I reached the living room, the toolbox was open exactly as I'd left it, but something in the air felt different, like a breath had passed through the room, like the atmosphere had shifted by a degree or two. I closed the lid slowly, careful not to latch it yet. The iron key was still in my hand, warm again, inexplicably warm. The warmth pulsed faintly, like a quiet heartbeat. I didn't know whether my father had sealed something inside the box, or kept something outside from getting in, but I knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. Whatever he'd spent his life containing, I had just invited forward, and it had heard me. For the rest of the night, I couldn't go more than a few minutes without glancing at the toolbox, half expecting the lid to lift on its own, or something inside to shift again. I kept telling myself I should wait until morning, that whatever my father had spent decades guarding didn't need to be handled in the dead quiet between midnight and sunrise. But curiosity is its own kind of haunting. It sits behind your ribs and knocks softly, rhythmically, until ignoring it becomes more painful than the fear of what you might learn. The air in the house had gone heavy again, thick, in a way that made each breath feel intentional, as though the space itself was waiting for me to finish what I'd started. So I sat on the floor in front of the coffee table, legs folded beneath me like I was a kid again, leaning over a shoebox full of old trading cards. But this wasn't that kind of memory. The iron key still had a faint warmth, and even though I'd already unlocked the box, I couldn't bring myself to set the key down. It felt like a talisman now, something that connected me to my father's last instructions, as if the metal held the echo of his voice. I opened the lid again. The hinges creaked softly, but not from rust. The sound was too smooth, too controlled, like something inside was adjusting its posture each time the lid rose. Everything inside was exactly as I left it, though the Polaroid lay slightly angled, as if it had shifted a millimeter to the right. I stared at the items again: the leather notebook, the wrapped knife, the jar of black powder, the yellowed newspaper clipping, the Polaroid. Each object felt like it had its own gravity, its own orbit inside the box. But beneath all of it, beneath even the metal floor of the container, I sensed something else, like an echo trapped inside a chamber, not audible, more like the feeling of a memory you can't quite pull into focus. I decided to start with the knife. Dad was never without one, and if this was the one he chose to lock away, It had meaning. The flannel cloth around it was small and soft, worn thin in spots where hands had gripped it over years. I unwrapped it carefully. The knife inside had a wooden handle, darkened with age and oil, and a blade that looked older than the handle, older than the box, maybe older than my father's time with it. The metal wasn't rusted, but it wasn't polished either. It had a dull, almost stone-like texture. Etched along the spine were tiny notches, some deliberate, some ragged. Hunting marks, I thought at first. But no hunter makes irregular notches like these. These looked like someone had been marking occurrences, counted events, maybe kills. My stomach tightened at the idea of my father holding this blade in the woods at night, listening for something only he knew how to anticipate. I set the knife aside and reached for the jar. Up close, the black substance inside looked less like dust and more like fine ash. Not soft, but granular, like crushed charcoal mixed with something heavier. When I tilted the jar, the ash didn't move freely. It clung to the glass, sticking in unnatural clumps before peeling away like the slow unfurl of something viscous. And in the dim light from the lamp, I could swear the ash pulsed once, as if it responded to movement. My breath caught. I set the jar down quickly, careful not to jostle it. Whatever that ash was, it wasn't simple. It wasn't inert. The leather notebook drew me next. I untied the fraying string again and flipped past the pages from before. The next entry was dated 1983, nearly a decade after the missing boy article. Dad would have been in his 20s then. The handwriting was darker, pressed harder into the page. It read, "It tried again last night. Same place, same voice. It knows I'm the one keeping watch now. It knows Sam is gone. It knows I won't let it have the next one." A pit opened in my chest as I read the name, Sam, my father's brother, the missing boy. The next page was a list. 1. Don't whistle in the woods. 2. Don't follow the lights. 3. Don't speak if it uses your voice. 4. Keep the ash sealed. 5. Blood draws it closer. 6. Light confuses it. 7. Burial only slows it. 8. Binding is temporary. I felt a cold line of sweat crawl down my spine. These were rules, not suggestions, not warnings. Rules written by someone who had tested each one with fear and bone-deep certainty. Dad had lived by these. Dad had survived by these. And the more I read, the more I realized something I didn't want to name yet. My father had been fighting something. The kind of something that lives in the spaces between stories people don't tell. I turned the page again. It follows the bloodline. It always has. My hands shook. I had to close the notebook just to breathe. The Polaroid came last. I flipped it over again, forcing myself to look at it under the lamplight instead of a quick glance that allowed imagination to fill in the horrors. The flash illuminated the first few trees clearly, pale bark stark against the dark. But the figure between the trunks wasn't just tall. It was wrong. Too long in the limbs, too narrow in the torso. The head tilted in a way no human head can tilt without snapping. And the eyes, they weren't reflections of light. They were light. Two faint focused points staring back at the camera with awareness. I realized something then. My father had taken this photo, which meant he had been this close to it. Close enough for flash to catch its outline. The walls of the house creaked sharply. A sudden, violent pop that sounded like wood splitting under weight. I jumped up, heart pounding. The sound came from the back door, the same direction as the woods. I froze, listening. The house grew still again. No wind, no rustling branches, no footsteps, nothing. But then, faintly, I heard something else. A soft, low hum. Not mechanical, not electrical, organic, almost like a voice trying to remember how to form a sound. It came from the woods. The dog upstairs whimpered again. I moved toward the back window, notebook still in hand. I lifted the curtain slowly. The oak tree stood motionless in the dim moonlight. The branches looked like fingers reaching for something they could never grasp. But there, right at the edge of the tree line, something shifted. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal, not a shadow. Something in between. When the shape leaned a fraction forward, catching what little moonlight cut through the clouds, I felt my entire body go cold. It wasn't fully visible, just an outline between the trees. Too tall, too thin to be a person, but the posture was unmistakable. Watching, waiting, for me. I dropped the curtain and backed away. The humming stopped instantly. Silence filled the space again. Heavy, thick, anticipating. The box on the table seemed to absorb the silence. The jar of ash pulsed once. The Polaroid shifted a hair to the left. It was subtle, but enough. The presence in the woods was connected to the box, to the notebook, to the ash, to whatever happened to Sam in 1976. And now, to me. My father hadn't just been afraid of what was inside the toolbox. He'd been afraid of what it was keeping out, and what it was keeping from returning. The truth settled into my bones like an unwelcome guest. Opening the box didn't unleash something. It summoned something already searching, and it had finally found me. I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I jolted awake with the sense that something was standing just out of sight, waiting for my breathing to steady before leaning closer. By dawn, the house felt colder than usual, in that way old houses do, when something invisible has moved through them and disturbed the temperature. I avoided the windows. I avoided the back door, but I couldn't avoid the toolbox. It sat on the coffee table like a silent companion, the lid still loosely open, as if it expected me to come back, as if it knew everything inside. It was only half understood. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat cross-legged on the floor again, pulling the leather notebook closer. The fraying string felt fragile, like it had been tied and untied thousands of times by hands steadier than mine. I untied it slowly, laying the notebook open across my lap. The pages were soft at the corners, the ink slightly smudged from humidity or old sweat, the handwriting consistent. My father's blocky, deliberate script that he always said came from drafting class in high school. But the content was nothing a drafting teacher could have prepared him for. The next entry after the list of rules was written in harsher strokes, almost carved into the page. It watches from the edges because the edges are its doorway. I reread that line 4 or 5 times, the words sinking deeper each time. My father had known something about the creature in the woods, something that made the tree line more boundary than landscape. I flipped the page. The next entry was longer, dated 8 years later, the pen darker, like he'd pressed too hard. When Sam disappeared, I thought he wandered too far. That was the lie we all told, but I saw it the night before. The way it leaned between the trees, the way it tried to mimic our voices. I wasn't fast enough. It took him because it could. Blood calls to blood. My breath hitched. My father hadn't been unaware that his brother was taken. He had witnessed it, and he had spent decades trying to stop the same fate from reaching me. The rules continued in short fragments scattered across several pages. Don't look directly at it unless you want it to come closer. Don't let it speak first. Don't answer if it asks who you are. Everything it does is an invitation. If you feel watched, you are. Don't whistle in the woods. It whistles back. Each rule read like a confession from someone who had learned them the hard way. My father had never believed in superstition. He didn't read ghost stories or talk about folklore. He trusted engines, tools, weather patterns, things that made sense. But this notebook, painted him as someone who had lived his adult life, building barricades against something that didn't belong in the world he understood. I turned to a page near the middle, stained with something darker than ink. On it, my father had sketched a crude drawing of the woods behind the house. The oak tree marked with an X, the fence line, the hill that dipped toward the old creek bed. But at the base of the trees, in a shaky hand, he'd drawn a tall figure composed of jagged lines. The proportions were wrong. Elongated arms, a narrow torso, a head too tall, all wrapped in some shape he didn't seem able to draw fully. Beside it, he'd written, "It doesn't come from the woods only hide it." I shut the notebook for a moment, pressing my hand against the worn leather as if I could press the meaning of those words away from my mind. But the truth was harder to ignore now. Something had been hunting my father's family for at least 2 generations. Something that had taken Sam. Something that had been warded off only by rituals and rules my father crafted through trial and terror. My gaze drifted to the jar of ash. The granules inside had settled into a slope, but the top layer seemed disturbed, as though something had shifted during the night. I leaned closer. A faint pattern marked the glass, like the ash had pressed against the surface in the shape of a hand. 5 faint streaks, blurred but undeniably intentional. I jerked back. My stomach dropped. Something inside the jar had touched the glass from within. My father's notebook suddenly felt urgent again. I reopened it and flipped to the back pages. Some entries were frantic, written in slanted letters, as if he'd been writing while pacing or shaking. One section read, "The ash isn't what it is, it's what's left of what it was. Burned once, buried twice. It remembers." Another line, darker. "It speaks through memories. It knows the voice of anyone it follows. And then, if it ever finds you, don't let it finish the sentence." I didn't know whether that meant don't let it speak my name, or don't let it imitate someone I loved, or don't let it issue a command, but I did know something had spoken near the tree line last night, something that hummed like a voice relearning sound. My hands went numb. I flipped another page. This one was dated more recently, just 2 years ago. My father had been in his 60s. It's getting closer again, not every night, but enough. Below it, the box was meant to be a tomb for what remained of Sam's killer. It was never meant to be opened. I felt that line like a punch to the ribs. A tomb. My father had trapped something inside. The ash, or the knife, or the notebook. Something that had once belonged to the creature that took Sam. Something that wasn't fully dead. The last sentence chilled me most of all. The moment the lid opens, it knows where you are. My breath caught. I stared at the open toolbox. I thought of the humming in the woods, the misaligned lid, the shifting Polaroid, the dog's sudden fear, the knock inside the house, the warm key. Every sign pointed to the same conclusion. By unlocking the box, I had called something that had been waiting. The floorboards near the hallway creaked sharply, as if someone stepped on them, not the soft, gradual popping of an old house. A clear, singular footstep. I froze, notebook half open in my hand. The house fell silent again, but the pressure returned. The same pressure I'd felt when the creature watched from the tree line. Like the air was aware of me. I stood slowly, listening. The quiet deepened until it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Then, a soft click from the back door, not the lock, the latch, as if someone had touched it, tested it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I gripped the notebook like it could serve as a shield. The rules echoed through my mind. Don't let it see you first. Don't answer. Don't follow. Don't let it use your voice. Don't look directly at it. I stepped toward the hallway with careful, silent feet. The air grew colder the closer I came to the back door. The dog whimpered behind me, low and frightened. I stopped 3 feet away from the door and listened. Nothing. Just the cold. Just the waiting. I turned back toward the living room and stopped. The jar of ash had moved. It now sat exactly in the center of the toolbox, where moments earlier it had been placed near the side. The Polaroid beside it had shifted another fraction of an inch. The knife lay at a slightly different angle, as if someone had lifted it and set it back down with careless precision. But the worst part, the part that made my skin crawl and my heart pound, the jar lid was loose, unscrewed half a turn. Not enough to spill, but enough to say, "I touched this. I'm coming closer." I didn't realize I was backing up until my shoulder hit the wall. The notebook trembled in my hand. My father's words echoed again. The box was never meant to be opened. I understood, finally, what he had been guarding all those years, what he had buried, what he had bound, what he had feared passing on. Not the box, not the items inside, not even the ash, but the attention of something that hunts a family the way it hunts a territory, something that follows inheritance like a bloodhound follows scent, something that had been waiting decades for the next Calder to open the lid, and now it knew my name. The rest of the day moved in a strange, disjointed rhythm, like the hours weren't passing naturally, but being pushed along by something unseen. I kept the curtains closed and the lights low, not because I believed light would save me, but because I didn't want to give whatever was outside a clear view of where I stood in the house. The jar of ash stayed exactly where it had shifted, centered, deliberate, like a chess piece set down by an opponent far more patient than I'd ever learned to be. Every time I looked at it, a tightness formed in my chest, a mix of dread and certainty, because the jar was no longer an object. It was a boundary, a cage, a reminder that something once had a body, and that body had not rotted away quietly. Something lived inside the grains, something that wanted shape again. And Dad, my father, the man I thought I knew, had spent years making sure it didn't get one. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me, flipping through page after page of my father's experiences, each entry pulling me deeper into a life he never allowed me to see. The writing changed over the years, the line weight shifting from youthful confidence to weary vigilance. Early entries described sightings, shapes at the edge of the yard, a figure that ducked behind trees the moment a lantern swung in its direction, lights flickering in the woods that weren't from any human source. But as time went on, the entries became less observational and more fearful. One page from the mid-90s read, "It knows the routines. It waits between the branches. It comes closer when the moon is low." Another entry, "It doesn't walk like a deer. It doesn't move like a man. It moves like memory trying to animate bone." I ran my thumb over that line again and again, wondering what my father had seen that made him describe movement as something trying to relearn its own body. Further in the notebook, I found entries about nights my father had come home late when I was a kid, nights when I remembered the back door closing quietly long after I'd gone to bed. He had written about watching it from the shed window, the lantern casting a warm circle around him as the thing moved just outside the light's reach. "If I hold the light steady, it won't cross," he wrote. "But if I look away, even to blink, it shifts closer. It tests me. It waits for weakness." I remembered waking sometimes to see a faint glow from the backyard, thinking Dad was working on something mechanical, but he'd been standing guard, protecting me without ever letting me know danger existed. I flipped to another page and felt a coldness settle under my ribs. Dad had written an account dated the night before my 8th birthday. I remembered that night vividly because I'd woken to the sound of him shouting outside, and assumed he'd stubbed his toe or spilled something. But in the notebook, he wrote, "It tried to speak to him tonight, from the trees, used my voice. He almost answered. My breath caught. I never heard that. I never heard anything calling my name. But Dad had. He had been outside, stopping it, intercepting whatever force had tried to lure me toward the woods. It learns the cadence," he wrote. "It got the tone right this time." A trembling passed through me so quickly I almost didn't register it. He had kept this from me. He had fought this for me. He had never once let me see fear in his face. A hollow ache formed in my chest. Part guilt, part grief, part something darker. Realization. Dad hadn't been paranoid. He'd been hunted. I pushed away from the table and walked to the back door, placing my hand against the cold glass without opening the curtain. I could feel the stillness on the other side, a silence that felt too deliberate to be nature, a waiting quiet, the kind where every twig in the forest seems poised to snap if breathed on wrong. I tried to imagine my father standing in this exact spot decades earlier, lantern in hand, listening to the same silence. What did he see the first time it stepped into view? Did it wear a shape? Did it move in jerks? Or did it slide like shadow? Did he hear Sam's voice? Or did it take years before it learned to copy a voice it hadn't fully consumed? The more I read, the more something inside me shifted. Not fear, acceptance. A slow, dawning understanding that this wasn't just a creature. It was a pattern, a cycle, a presence that had attached itself to my family long before I existed, long before my father had the words to describe it. It didn't stalk at random. It followed lineage. When Sam vanished in '76, Dad became its focus. And when Dad grew older, too tired, too worn down to keep nightly vigil, it began waiting for the next Calderman to claim. It waited for me. I returned to the notebook and turned to the page with the Polaroid taped beside it. The photo showed the creature in the same posture as before, leaning between trees, head tilted, eyes reflecting light like polished stones. Below the photo, Dad had scribbled a note. Eyes like mirrors. They don't shine. They return what they take. My stomach knotted. I couldn't shake the memory of the moment last night when I saw something shift in the tree line. The way it leaned, the way the air thickened, the way the dog had reacted before I even reached the room. Dad's description matched perfectly what I had glimpsed, and the notebook confirmed something else, something I'd already begun to suspect. What I saw wasn't the first time it had come that close. It had been lingering for years, waiting for an opportunity. It had watched Dad, and now it was watching me. A loud thump startled me, the sound of something hitting the side of the house. I jumped to my feet, heart hammering, eyes scanning the walls. Another thump, then a soft, dragging sound. Something brushing along the siding, slow, deliberate. It moved from the back wall toward the window nearest the living room. Then it stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, pressurized, heavy like a held breath. The dog whined from upstairs, shrinking back from something I couldn't see. I approached the nearest window, careful not to let my silhouette reach the curtain. The dragging sound resumed, this time higher up the wall, like fingertips tapping along the siding. Then, unmistakably, something scraped across the glass. A long, slow line. Not claws, not nails. Something else. Something that didn't scratch so much as trace the shape of the window frame. A cold sweat prickled across my back. The rules echoed through my mind again. Don't look directly at it. Don't let it speak first. Don't answer. Don't acknowledge. I pressed my back against the wall, forcing myself to stay still. The scraping stopped. Silence followed. Thick, intentional. Then, A soft, low hum, right outside the window. Not a tune, not a whisper, a single sustained note, shaky, like vocal cords made of raw memory rather than flesh. It was trying to speak. My mouth went dry. I swallowed hard and backed away from the window. Every muscle tightened. The humming stretched a fraction higher, searching for shape, searching for tone, searching for my father's voice, maybe searching for mine. I grabbed the notebook like a lifeline. My father had left instructions, not explanations, not comfort, but a map of how to survive something that didn't belong in any rational world. I flipped to the final entries, pages worn thin from years of fear-soaked handling. If it finds you, don't meet its eyes. If it calls you, don't respond. If it breathes against the glass, don't stand still. If the ash stirs, it is remembering. If the lights flicker, it is close. If you feel watched, you are. And if it knocks, don't open the door. I froze, because I'd read every entry except this one, and the ink was fresh, as if written not years ago, but days or hours. A knock sounded at the front door. 3 soft taps, rhythmic, older than memory. My blood ran cold. Whatever my father had seen all those years, whatever had taken Sam, whatever had waited in the woods for a Calder man, was now standing on the other side of my door. And it wasn't knocking to enter. It was knocking because it knew the rules, and it wanted to see if I did too. The knocking didn't come again, but somehow that was worse than if it had continued, because silence leaves too much room for imagination. And imagination is never gentle when fear is already pressed against your spine. I stood frozen in the living room, the notebook open in my hand, the box half latched on the table, the jar of ash sitting like an occupied seat between us. The 3 taps had been soft, almost polite, but something in the rhythm told me they weren't meant as a greeting. They were a reminder, a demonstration that whatever lived at the edge of my family line could now stand on my porch. I swallowed hard, trying to listen past the thunder of my own heartbeat. The house was silent again, but it wasn't empty. The walls felt too close. The air felt too tight. It was like being in a room with a sleeping animal you weren't sure was actually asleep. I backed away from the door, careful not to make the floorboards groan. My father's words burned behind my eyes. If it knocks, don't open the door. And I understood why now. The knock wasn't an attempt to enter. It was an attempt to be invited. Everything about this thing, its silence, its mimicry, its patience, ran on invitations. I held the notebook like a shield and forced myself to move, to breathe, to remember how human bodies function when fear tries to cut the strings. The box on the table seemed to watch me, its metal surface catching just enough lamplight to look like an eye turning in my direction. For a moment, I considered closing it, slamming the lid down, locking it again, pretending none of this was happening. But the key was warm in my pocket. The lid had already opened. The ash had already moved. There was no going back. I walked over to the table slowly, each step deliberate, my pulse loud enough to make my vision sharpen. The jar had shifted again, so subtly I almost doubted myself. The lid was loosened a hair more. The ash lifted in a tiny peak toward the top, like something inside had pressed upward. I sat in front of the box and pressed my fingertips to the cool metal rim. It felt like touching the border between 2 worlds. The notebook lay open beside me, the ink still dark, almost wet-looking, on the last page, the warning I didn't remember reading before that moment. If the ash stirs, it is remembering. Remembering what? Its body, its purpose, its hunger. My father had trapped something. Not fully, not permanently, but enough that the box had served more as leash than tomb. And now the leash had slackened. The thought made my skin prickle. The creature outside wasn't here for me. Not completely. It was here for the box, for what it had once been, for what the ash represented, for the piece of itself that had been taken. The house creaked again, as if shifting under the weight of expectation. I looked toward the front door. The hall light flickered once, soft, like a heartbeat. The dog upstairs began pacing, nails tapping the floor in frantic little patterns, stopping every few seconds, as if something in the walls drew his attention. I needed to move. I needed to check the windows, the doors, the yard. But a deeper instinct, one I didn't recognize as mine, kept me rooted by the toolbox. The creature had followed bloodlines. It had followed my father. Now it followed me. And whatever piece of it my father had stolen was calling out with every grain of ash. My eyes drifted to the knife wrapped in flannel. The blade looked older now, almost darker, like it had absorbed the shadows in the room. The notches along the spine seemed deeper, too, as if they shifted when I wasn't looking. I reached for it, but stopped with my fingers hovering an inch above the handle. The air around it felt different, heavier, charged. The notebook had mentioned binding. Burial only slowed it. The knife must have played a role in whatever binding my father had done to keep the creature's essence inside the box. Something about the blade felt like it belonged more to the creature than to my father. Maybe it had been taken from it, or maybe it had been used against it. Whatever the truth, I didn't want to touch it. Not yet. Outside, something brushed against the siding again. A long, slow drag, like fingertips testing the boundaries of the house. Then a pause. Then a second drag. Higher, near the window. The air turned cold. Not a normal chill. This cold moved with intention, seeping in from the direction of the sound, like the creature itself was drawing breath against the wall, cooling the wood beneath its presence. I moved slowly toward the back window, keeping to the edges of the room the way prey animals move, in the presence of a predator. I didn't open the curtain. I didn't need to. I could feel it, the awareness, the attention. It was standing just beyond the glass. I stepped back. The creature didn't knock again. It didn't hum. It didn't scrape. It simply waited. And somehow that was the most terrifying thing it had done yet. I turned back to the box and opened the notebook again, searching for anything I hadn't read, something I'd missed, anything that explained what the creature wanted beyond proximity. Near the end of the notebook, in handwriting far more frantic than the rest, I found an entry written over 2 pages. Some words crossed out so violently the paper had nearly torn. It wants the part I took. It wants the box. It wants what it lost. It wants to be whole. I exhaled slowly, the realization settling like ice in my chest. My father hadn't simply trapped something. He had stolen a piece of the creature, something vital, something that kept it from fully forming. The ash wasn't remains. It was essence, a fragment of the creature's being, a piece of its body, or mind, or memory, and it needed the box to become whole again. That's why it had followed my father for so long. That's why it had mimicked voices, why it watched, why it waited, not for an opportunity to kill, but to reunite with what it had lost. I looked at the box as if seeing it for the first time. It wasn't a container. It was a missing limb. A quiet click came from the hallway, the back door, the latch, something testing it again. The dog let out a strangled bark, followed by a whine. I rushed toward the hallway, but halfway there, something changed. The house didn't shake. The walls didn't creak. It was subtler than that. The hallway light flickered, not once, not twice, but in a steady, deliberate pattern. A rhythm, a signal. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. I froze. That was Morse code. SOS. My father had taught me that pattern when I was a kid, tapping it on the dinner table until I memorized it. He said every Calder should know how to signal for help because life sometimes gets loud when you need it quiet. But I didn't feel hope when the light flickered. I felt dread because the creature mimicked voices. It could mimic signals. It could mimic anything it had watched long enough. I backed away, forcing my legs to move. I grabbed the notebook and returned to the living room, my breath shallow. The box vibrated softly, not shaking, vibrating, a low hum rising from the metal, like something inside was responding. For a moment, I considered grabbing the box, running, leaving the house and driving until the gas tank was empty, but the thought died as quickly as it rose. It didn't matter where I went. The creature didn't follow distance. It followed inheritance. It followed the ash. It followed the bloodline. The notebook slid open on its own when I set it down, landing on a page I hadn't reached. A single line in my father's hand. If you ever open the box, it will come for what I stole, and for you, because now you are its keeper. Something touched the front door, a gentle, searching press. Then the doorknob turned a fraction of an inch, not rattled, not forced, turned, tested, recognizing, and I understood something bone deep. It didn't want to break in. It wanted me to give the box back, the box and myself with it. For a long moment, the turning of the doorknob was the only movement in the entire house. A tiny metallic rotation so restrained and deliberate that it made every hair on my arm stand on end. It wasn't forcing entry. It was testing the shape of the boundary between us, learning the mechanics of how humans come and go. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make the floorboards creak. The house felt too still, too compressed, as if all the oxygen had been drawn toward the front door, where that thing waited like a memory trying to become flesh again. The dog upstairs whimpered once, soft, exhausted, terrified. I found myself holding the notebook tighter, fingers pressing into the leather as if it contained warmth or strength or clarity. But the truth was that the only thing that mattered now, the only thing that linked me to whatever this creature wanted, was the jar of ash. I could feel its weight even from across the room. I could feel the wrongness inside it, a kind of coiled anticipation. The creature outside wasn't here to kill me quickly or break its way in. It wanted reassembly, wholeness, completion, and everything inside the box, every object, every grain, felt like a fragmented piece of something that remembered itself too well. I moved toward the toolbox again, this time slower, like approaching something alive. The ash had shifted another inch upward, forming a small, spiraling mound against the inside wall of the jar, like whatever was inside had pressed a shape upward before it lost momentum. I crouched down, leaning close enough to fog the glass. For a heartbeat, just one, I saw movement inside, a subtle flex like the twitch of a buried muscle. The ash recoiled, then relaxed. It wasn't rising randomly. It was trying to gather itself. I unscrewed the lid carefully, intending only to tighten it back down to keep whatever essence lived inside from escaping. But the moment the lid loosened in my hand, a faint exhale escaped the jar. Not air, not pressure, an exhale, like a sigh of relief. I froze. My hands shook. The air around the table grew colder, sinking into my bones. I forced the lid shut hard. The ash rattled in a quick metallic tremor. A sound like distant nails dragging across wood echoed outside the front door in response. I felt my pulse in my throat. I had made contact with it. Unintentional, fragile, but contact. It knew the jar was open. It felt the jar being closed again. It responded. I sat down hard on the floor as the truth settled into me like cold water. The ash was not dormant. It was waiting. And with the jar unsealed even for a breath, the boundary between it and the creature outside had thinned. My father hadn't just trapped a remnant. He had trapped an anchor, a tether, something the creature needed to reclaim its full shape. I picked up the notebook again, flipping desperately through pages I had already read and not read, searching for a way to stop what felt inevitable. Halfway through the back section, written in smaller script, almost like he was afraid to give these words too much permanence, I found a line that made my stomach twist. It knows the shape of its missing piece. If the fragment awakens, the body will move toward it. I swallowed hard. The ash was awakening, slowly, actively, and the thing at my door, whatever ancient pattern of hunger and mimicry it followed, felt that awakening. A thump hit the siding, harder this time. Not a test, a demand. The creature was growing impatient. I pressed my back to the couch, breathing through my nose so quietly it almost hurt. The jar vibrated softly, not enough to move, but enough to send a faint buzzing into the air. I watched the ash through the glass, fascinated and horrified. A small ripple passed through it, as though something invisible brushed its surface. Then, slowly, the ash began to lift. Not all of it, just a thin thread that curled upward like smoke in reverse. It reached toward the lid, tapping against the metal with tiny, deliberate pats, trying to find cracks, trying to find release. "No," I whispered without thinking, and the moment the word left my mouth, a sound answered from outside, low, imitated, testing the shape of the syllable, as if the creature had been waiting for any scrap of sound to mimic. My blood froze. The notebook warned me, "Don't speak if it can hear you." The air filled with pressure, like a storm forming inside the walls. The jar shook. The dog upstairs barked once, then whimpered and went silent so fast it made my chest seize. I tightened the lid as hard as I could, twisting until the thin rubber seal squealed under the pressure. The ash inside pressed upward, a wave hitting the inside surface like a trapped breath. The lights flickered, first once, then twice. My father wrote that flickering meant proximity, meant the creature was pressing against boundaries. The flickering stopped, but the room felt wrong, quiet, electric, like static crawling under paint. Then I heard footsteps, not outside, upstairs, slow, measured, weight shifting across the boards in a familiar cadence. I stood still, notebook clutched in one hand, jar in the other. Dad's footsteps, Dad's exact rhythm, Dad's pace. But my father was dead. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. Silence stretched so thin it hummed. Then, softly, almost gently, the creature spoke. "Hey, Aaron," my father's voice. It wasn't perfect. The tone was right, but the warmth was wrong. The pitch was right, but the breath between syllables was off by half a heartbeat. The voice drifted down the stairs, the way cold air falls through open doors. "You home?" I didn't move. I didn't answer. The notebook drilled the rule into my skull. Don't let it speak first. It had, which meant every word now was a trap. The voice tried again, closer this time. "Aaron." It tilted the vowels like it was adjusting its grip on my name. A shadow stretched across the top of the stairs, long and thin, bending in ways a human shadow shouldn't. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The creature took one slow step down. The wood creaked, the shadow elongated. Then the ash inside the jar surged upward, slamming against the lid. The creature stopped mid-step, It knew. It felt the movement. It turned toward the living room, drawn directly to the box. I backed away on instinct. Jar clutched to my chest. The lights flickered again. The shadow on the stairs twisted, shortened, then lengthened again, as if the creature couldn't decide on its shape. It stepped down another stair. Its foot, if you could call it a foot, made a sound that wasn't weight but intention. I looked at the box. I looked at the ash. I looked at the notebook. I realized what my father had been doing all those years. He hadn't been protecting the world from the creature. He hadn't been protecting the creature from the world. He had been protecting the creature's missing piece from itself. The creature wanted its essence. The ash wanted its body, and I was standing between them. The shadow reached the last stair. The voice spoke again, softer now, coaxing. "Aaron, bring it here." The jar pulsed in my hands. The box rattled. The lights browned out for half a second. The dog whimpered from under the bed upstairs. And in that moment, in the cold, breathless hush between the creature's voice and the ash pressing upward, I understood the most important truth of my father's notebook. This wasn't a haunting. It was a reunion, one I could not allow to happen. I didn't let myself think. Thinking would have broken whatever fragile instinct was keeping my feet planted and my breath held behind my teeth. The creature's shadow stretched across the floor from the bottom of the stairs, long and trembling, like it wasn't cast by a single body, but by something deciding which pieces to wear. Its voice, my father's voice, rolled softly through the living room again, trying the shape of my name in different rhythms, like someone tapping at piano keys to find the right note. Aaron, the word wavered slightly at the end, the way my dad's voice used to when he called me in from the yard, except this version felt practiced, like someone wearing a mask and adjusting it as they spoke. I clutched the jar against my chest, feeling the ash pulse once, a small internal shudder as if trying to recognize its missing half. The notebook dangled from my other hand, spine bent, pages trembling with the tiny movements of my grip. I stepped backward until the back of my head brushed the wall, the cold drywall grounding me in a reality that felt thinner by the second. The creature shifted 1 foot forward onto the living room rug. No footsteps, no weight, just movement, and the lights dimmed in a soft, sighing kind of way. The air in the house thickened with the same pressure that comes right before a storm breaks open. It wasn't trying to hide its presence anymore. It wanted me to see it. It wanted me to misunderstand it. It wanted me to hand over the ash without it having to cross whatever invisible line my father spent decades reinforcing. I opened the notebook with my thumb, flipping to the page that held my father's final coherent rules. The ink was smudged near the top, probably from his hands shaking, but the words were still clear enough. If it stands where you can see it, it thinks you're ready to listen. Don't listen. I swallowed hard. The creature took another step, and for the first time, I saw the faintest outline of its form just beyond the foot of the stairs. A human shape stretched wrong, as though someone had tried to redraw my father from memory and misunderstood the proportions. The head was too tall, the shoulders too narrow, the arms slightly too long. Its outline flickered, bending inward and outward like it was being pulled across invisible threads. My throat tightened. Dad had seen this thing for years. He'd fought it, avoided it, learned its habits. And all that time, he'd never once let me know it existed. I realized then that the greatest part of his fear had never been the creature itself. It had been the possibility that one day I would have to stand where he once stood. The creature's hand, if you could call the shape a hand, lifted slightly, palm turned up, like it wanted me to place the jar into it. The impossibility of its posture made my stomach twist. It didn't look threatening. It looked pleading, as if it wanted me to believe it wasn't whole without what I held. But the notebook's next line burned through my mind with a clarity so sharp it felt like a slap. It never begs, it only mimics begging. Don't trust its shape. My fingers tightened around the jar until my knuckles ached. The ash shivered in response, rising along the inner glass like a tide reacting to the moon. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain hitting old tools. The house felt alive with pressure, the walls holding their breath the way I held mine. I turned a page in the notebook with shaking fingers, searching for something. Some rule, some instruction, some hint that my father had found a way to beat this thing rather than just hold it back. My eyes skimmed frantic entries. The jar is its anchor. The knife marks time. Light confuses it but doesn't stop it. Salt slows it. Iron distracts it. But none of those were instructions for stopping it. They were instructions for delaying it, surviving it, managing it. My father hadn't defeated this creature. He'd learned to live with the constant presence of something that wanted to reclaim a lost piece of itself. And the moment he died, that burden shifted to me as naturally as a last name. The creature stepped closer. My father's face flickered across its silhouette, not clearly, but as a faint suggestion, like someone trying to sculpt a memory out of smoke. "Son," it whispered. My breath hitched. That word, it had the exact cadence Dad used the day I left for college. The same almost laugh tucked behind the vowel, but the warmth was wrong. It was like hearing a recording of a memory rather than the memory itself. I realized with a cold drop of certainty that it wasn't trying to lure me into the woods like it had tried with my father. It was trying something new, something it had learned in the time since Dad last held the jar, something tailored to me. I shut my eyes hard, pressing the notebook against my forehead as if the leather could shield me. Don't let it speak like him. Don't let it become him. That line hit me like a physical blow. I forced myself to open my eyes again. The creature had stepped into the open now, its form clearer, though still warped. Its arms hung too straight, its neck too rigid. It leaned forward slightly, the way Dad used to when checking whether I was hurt as a kid. Every detail was almost right. Almost. And that was what made it horrifying. The not rightness, the nearly but not quite human shape of it. The way its shadow lagged half a second behind its movements. Its eyes weren't eyes. They were dark, hollow pits lit from within by something faintly reflective. Like a memory of light rather than light itself. It extended its hand further. The ash inside the jar pulsed. The lights flickered violently. The notebook shook in my hand as I read another line. If it tries to take human form, it is preparing to reclaim the fragment. The fragment. The ash. Sam. My knees nearly buckled. The ash wasn't just the creature's essence. It was the remains of my father's brother, or something the creature had made from him. A sudden electric pressure swept through the room, pushing against me like a hot wind. The creature was done waiting. It stepped fully away from the stairs, its body warping as it moved, bending at too many joints, its form oscillating between imitation and its true shape. My breath turned shallow. I backed toward the kitchen, jar pressed against my ribs, notebook clutched in my other hand. I needed a plan, a rule, a ritual, something. My father's voice, his true voice, whispered in memory. Some things stay alive as long as you fear them. Fear fed it, avoidance fed it, an invitation fed it. But maybe defiance didn't. That thought came not as courage, but as something deeper, something ancestral, something my father must have felt 1,000 times while standing beneath the lantern light. I stepped forward. The creature froze. It cocked its head like an animal, hearing an unfamiliar sound. I raised the jar. "No," I said, not to the creature, but to the ash inside. No, you don't get to go back to it. The ash writhed. The creature shuddered. The lights blew out. Darkness swallowed the room. Heavy, alive, breathing. Something moved toward me. Fast. I held the jar higher. The ash inside convulsed like a muscle spasm. The creature stopped inches from my face. Its breath was cold. Its shape flickered. I opened the notebook to the final, half-torn page. A single sentence waited there. The only way to break the cycle is to destroy what it's trying to become. I stared at the jar, at the ash, at the creature waiting to reclaim it, and I understood what my father had never been able to finish. The ash wasn't a fragment of the creature. It was a seed, and if I didn't destroy it, the creature would finally become whole. The darkness that swallowed the room felt different from any power outage I'd ever stood in. It wasn't empty. It had weight, texture, a kind of slick density that clung to the edges of the furniture and pressed against my skin with the slow persistence of rising water. I could hear the creature breathing somewhere in front of me, a soft, uneven sound, like air dragged through branches. My chest tightened as I raised the jar higher, the ash vibrating in rapid, panicked pulses. It wasn't trying to reunite with the creature anymore. It was reacting to danger, like something recognizing that the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. I held the notebook open with my trembling hand, but I couldn't see the page. I only remembered the words, "Destroy what it's trying to become." My father had written that line near the end of his life, when his hands were probably too unsteady to grind the ash or burn the jar or force the cycle to end. Maybe he was too weak, too afraid of the creature retaliating. Maybe he thought he needed me to do it. Maybe he'd always known this burden wasn't meant to die with him. My breath fogged the air, visible even in near darkness. The creature's breath did the same, its vapor drifting like thin strands of cold smoke. Closer now, close enough that I could hear the faint wet click of something inside its throat trying to imitate a swallow. I felt along the wall with my free hand until my fingers brushed the edge of the counter, the stove, the lighter, the knife block. Something, anything, I could use to destroy the ash before the creature managed to take it back. My father had used rituals he learned from old books, from veterans who whispered about things they saw overseas, from local stories buried in backwoods folklore. But my body operated on instinct alone now. My hand knocked into a metal pot, which rattled softly. The creature's breathing hitched, then resumed. It heard me. It was waiting, not for me to move, for me to hesitate. The moment I hesitated, it would take the jar from my hands. I pulled open a drawer blindly, rummaging with frantic fingers until I hit something small and metallic. The lighter. I flicked it once. The spark flashed, illuminating the silhouette in front of me for less than a second. But that was enough. Its face, or what it used as a face, was too smooth, too stretched, like clay pulled too far. Its eyes were cavernous hollows lit by reflected light that didn't belong to anything natural. And behind it, the shadows bent inward, drawn toward its center the way debris gets sucked into a whirlpool. I flicked the lighter again, the flame catching this time. The creature recoiled, not from the flame, but from the jar I held up behind it. The flame painted the ash inside the glass in warm gold light, revealing something beneath the granules, something half-formed, something like a curled hand pressed against the inside. My breath caught in my throat. The jar burned with its own internal pulse, vibrating against my palm. Another line from the notebook echoed in my head. Fire weakens memory, not kills, weakens. It was enough. I shoved the lighter under the jar. The glass warmed quickly, then heated faster than I expected, the metal lid beginning to curl and ping the creature hissed, in my father's voice at first, then in another voice, younger, trembling. Sam, my father's brother. A voice I had never heard but recognized instantly because it carried the same shape as my father's when he was young. My hand shook violently, but I didn't stop. The ash inside rose like a living thing, pressing upward, writhing like something struggling in sleep. My fingers burned from the heat, but I held the flame steady. I felt the creature move, its limbs unfurling behind me, its shadow stretching across the walls as if trying to wrap around the room. Something cold brushed the back of my neck, a fingertip, a breath, a whisper of sound. I jerked forward and nearly dropped the jar. The creature surged then, the floor groaning beneath its weight, though I knew it didn't weigh anything. It moved like shadows poured across the floor, rising up, reaching for the jar. I pushed myself backward until my shoulder hit the kitchen cabinet. I twisted the lighter higher, the flame beginning to lick the bottom of the jar. The ash inside sizzled. A thin scream escaped the creature, not loud, but sharp, like something tearing through distance. The lights burst back on for a split second, then off again, flickering between worlds. In that stutter of vision, I saw its body ripple, shifting through shapes. A too-tall man, a spindled silhouette, a faceless thing, and finally, briefly, my father's face staring at me with hollow eyes. The sight nearly broke me, but grief is a strange kind of fuel. I used it. I used everything left in me. The jar cracked. A sharp, clear sound like ice breaking under strain. A hairline fracture crawled up the side. The ash convulsed, pressing against the crack. Another crack formed. The creature lunged. It didn't imitate my father this time. It didn't speak. It didn't hum. It roared. A sound like wind ripping through trees, like bones ground to dust, like a breath that wanted to fill lungs it didn't have. I screamed, not in fear, but in effort, and smashed the jar down on the counter. Glass exploded in a burst of heat and powder. Ash scattered across the stove, the counter, my hands. The creature froze. All movement stopped. All sound stopped. The world held still as if waiting to see what I had done. Then the ash ignited, not in flame, but in light, a blinding white glow that rippled across the counter like a shockwave. The creature reeled backward, its body buckling inward, its limbs twisting like someone had snapped invisible tendons. Its shape collapsed in on itself, the shadows around it contracting like air being sucked from a room. Its eyes, those empty reflective hollows, flared once as if in recognition or anger or loss, and then dimmed. The light grew. The creature shrank. The air pressure dropped. The house exhaled. A long, tired, final breath. When the light faded, the creature was gone. Nothing remained of it. Not a shadow, not a voice, not even the cold. Only the faint smell of burned earth and old memories. The box on the table snapped shut on its own, a sharp metallic clap, and then lay still. For the first time since opening it, the house felt like a house again. Not a hunting ground, not a trap, not a boundary line. I sank to the floor, breathing hard, pieces of glass clinging to my hands. The ash burned into faint gray streaks across my palms. My father's notebook lay open beside me, its final page blank, as if he had known I would finish the story he couldn't. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, leaning against the counter, the silence soft and strangely warm. Eventually, the dog crept down the stairs and nudged my shoulder, trembling but alive. I held him close, burying my face in his fur. The creature was gone. The cycle was broken. The ash destroyed. The seed burned, but the box remained. silent, shut, waiting. And I realized, with a heaviness I couldn't shake, that destruction does not erase a history, it only buries it. My father had spent his life guarding that burial. Now it would be my turn to guard whatever came after, because some things, once called, never fully leave. They simply learn new doorways. I didn't leave the house for 2 days after destroying the jar. I barely slept. When I did, the dreams were thin and flickering. Images of tree lines bending inward, of footsteps that didn't match the earth they landed on, of my father standing in the yard with a lantern held low, his eyes tired but determined. The creature never returned, not as a shadow, not as a sound, not even as that familiar pressure behind the walls, but silence has a way of making you second-guess your victories. Every creak became a warning. Every flicker of the hallway light made my throat tighten. But little by little, the house began to settle back into itself. The corners stopped feeling like places something could hide. The windows lost their watchful stillness. Even the air felt warmer, as if whatever made it cold had finally lifted its fingers from the siding. I opened the curtains slowly one morning and found the backyard empty. Just the oak tree swaying softly, its branches moving in a rhythm that felt almost relieved. The dog walked out onto the porch with me, sniffed the wind, and lay down in a patch of sun like he hadn't done in months. It took me until that moment to accept that the danger wasn't lingering in the woods anymore. It had been tied to the box, to what was inside it. And now that the ash was gone, the cycle my father spent his life navigating had finally ended. Cleaning the shattered glass from the stove took hours. The tiny fragments clung to my skin, catching the light like silver slivers of the thing that had tried to reassemble itself. When I swept the smallest pieces into a dustpan, I couldn't help but think how ash and glass were almost the same. Both the remains of something broken beyond repair. The notebook lay open on the counter beside me, its pages fluttering in the breeze from the cracked kitchen window. I thought about throwing it away, about burying it with what was left of the ash, maybe even burning it. But every time I tried to close the cover, my father's handwriting caught the corner of my eye. His words weren't warnings anymore. They were history. They were evidence of the life he lived when I wasn't looking. They were the only record of how he kept our family intact, despite the weight of something none of us ever asked to inherit. Destroying the notebook felt too much like destroying him, so I tucked it gently into a drawer beneath the sink, wrapped in an old dish towel, the way he used to wrap tools he didn't want scratched. The toolbox stayed on the coffee table for another day, its lid closed firmly, the metal cold, but no longer humming with that strange internal tension. I approached it the same way you approach an animal that finally fell asleep after pacing for hours. Cautious, unsure if touching it would wake something inside. But the box remained still, no warmth radiating through the lid, no shifting shadows beneath the metal. Whatever had given it weight beyond its hinges and screws was gone. When I finally lifted it, expecting heaviness, I was stunned by how ordinary it felt, as if the years of dread inside it had evaporated the moment the ash died. I turned it over in my hands and realized for the first time that it wasn't an antique or a family heirloom. It was mass-produced, bought probably from a hardware store like any other. My father had chosen this specific box, not because it was special, but because it wasn't. That made it easier to hide the truth inside something no one would think to question. I carried the box out to the shed behind the house, the same shed where my father had spent countless nights holding a lantern while something watched him from the trees. The dirt smelled damp. The walls creaked in a familiar way that felt almost nostalgic. I placed the box on a high shelf, turned off the shed light, and closed the door quietly behind me. I didn't lock it. For the first time, I didn't need to. Whatever had needed containing was gone, not converted, not passed on, gone. That night, I sat on the back steps with a blanket over my shoulders and watched the woods. The moon lit the branches softly, and the wind moved through the leaves like someone whispering far away. Nothing stared back at me from between the trees. Nothing pressed against the edge of the yard. I breathed for the first time without waiting for the air to freeze in my lungs. And yet, part of me couldn't help but wonder how many nights my father had sat in this exact place, wondering the same thing. He must have had quiet nights too, nights where the creature stayed just beyond reach, where the lantern light was enough to keep it from crossing the boundary. Maybe he'd even thought he'd beaten it once or twice. Maybe he'd hoped it would give up, but it never did. I ran my hand along the wooden step, imagining his boots resting in the same worn dent in the wood. My father had kept a war to himself, so I could grow up believing he was just a quiet man with tired hands and a locked toolbox. I used to resent him for being distant. Now I understood distance can be a shield. Silence can be protection. Secrets can be love, even when they feel like absence. The dog lifted his head once, ears twitching toward the tree line. I tensed, but then he simply yawned and lay back down. Nothing stirred, nothing shifted. The woods inhaled and exhaled like any normal stretch of land. The world had finally gone back to its proper shape. Before going inside, I looked up at the stars, something I hadn't done since the night I found the key under the oak tree. They looked clearer now, sharper somehow, like the sky had shed a weight it had carried for too long. Maybe it wasn't the sky that changed. Maybe I was finally seeing it without something standing between me and the world. I don't pretend the story ends here neatly. I still hear small noises in the house that make my pulse stutter. I still wake in the middle of the night, expecting to see a silhouette at the foot of the stairs. Trauma lingers the way smoke clings to fabric. But the fear that once pressed behind the walls is gone. The creature that stalked my father from adolescence to old age no longer has shape, or memory, or anchor. It's not out there rebuilding itself. It's not waiting at the tree line. It's not learning my name. Sometimes I wonder if destroying the ash released something deeper, some echo that will drift for years before fading completely. But then I remind myself of something my father wrote in the margins of one of the earliest notebook pages. Some things are only as strong as the attention we give them. For decades, the creature had my father's full attention. For a few weeks, it had mine. Now, it has neither. And whatever power it once held died in my kitchen, on a night when fear met resolve and resolve finally won. The last page of the notebook remains blank. I think my father left it that way intentionally, not because he ran out of words, but because he believed someone after him might need the space. I haven't written anything in it yet. Maybe I never will. Not every inheritance needs continuation. Some are meant to end quietly, with one final act of defiance. When I finally went to bed, the house felt like a house, not a warning, not a boundary, not a trap. Just four walls filled with the memories of two men who carried the same name and the same burden, but only one of whom lived long enough to set it down. I slept without dreaming. When morning came, the first thing I felt was sunlight. Not fear, not pressure, just light. For the first time, the world belonged entirely to the living. And for the first time, I understood that survival wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of finally being able to live one.